Hello everyone, this is Delbit's Workshop. In today's episode, we'll be going over part 2 of the Catan board build. So originally in the last episode, I had built one of these side pieces, just kind of spitballing in the program Create 3D based off of this model. So my original idea was that as long as this dimension matches this dimension, I could do a plug, I could do any kind of little like tail on the end of it, as long as it fits in the front here. My downfall was the software shifted this over a little bit because of the grid pattern layout. Anyway, so I created two and found out that they don't quite meet up. So it's a little bit off on both sides, a little bit bigger in the top than it should have been. So these were sadly a failure. A friend of mine actually came over and painstakingly took the time through Fusion 360 and actually fully CAD'd out this piece for me. Put on all the constraints, took a lot of time, and I'm very grateful for it. So I really enjoy Fusion, and he gave me a great deal of knowledge on it, but it is definitely something that I could take years to learn and still only scratch the surface of it. It is a phenomenal program and it's a massive program, but I'm grateful for the work that he did, and off of that, I ended up producing and creating these little guys. And there is some refinement needed. The ends don't quite meet on one side, and they meet perfectly to an extent on the other side with a little bit of gap. So I think I need to tune up my machine. So we're going to put in a different bit, run some different calibration tests, and then I'm going to continue printing because I know what he produced is correct. A little bit of variance means that my machine is not quite working exactly as it should. Since I produced the same piece twice with no variance in the programming, I know that it is on the hardware side of things. So I'm going to calibrate that, get a few more hexagons, and let's keep on going. So, kind of catch you up on what's been going on so far. I kind of haphazardly stuck in a little piece of wood here, just kind of keep some of that dust that was generating from going over onto the laptop. Otherwise, keeping the lid closed will work just fine. It just matters if you're actually using or checking on the computer itself. In my case, I just have some settings I played around with so that way I could close the lid. But all that to say, if you are working with Create 3D or any of your software, make sure to do an outside cut and make sure that you have an offset on the outside, not the inside of what you're cutting. Reason being for if you're cutting something out and you want a dimension for that item, in this case, I accidentally left the preset, which is inside cut. So the reason you'd want an inside cut on this is if you're trying to cut something out to have something you already have fit into that based on that dimension, or you're trying to get something to pass through this said board off of that dimension, that's when you want an inside cut. Otherwise, in this situation, if you do an inside cut and then what you actually want to cut out fits over it, this item would fit into this said hole, but I'm actually trying to take out and cut out this piece. So it didn't work for me, sadly. So that was one of my failures, but I learned something from it. Always, before you hit go or you create your G-code in a separate CAM software, double check yourself to make sure that your offset is cutting on the outside of the item. Now, if you're just sculpting something and you want to have something in front of you and you're not working off of very particularly specific dimensions, then you can choose just no offset, change the size of your bit. There's a couple different things, but that changes based on the software and when you're working with it to what you're creating. So in my case, if I'm cutting something out and I want that item in my hand to be a certain dimension, always choose the offset cut. So that being said, I created 2 cuts so far, and they are almost perfectly identical to each other. I had one failure in one instance where on this set, because of this whole gantry setup, having those little limiter switches, it started on the wrong spot and I didn't set my home position on this one. And what that did was it tried to drop the cut down lower and it stopped that switch. So then when I reset my home position again, properly Z'd it out and everything, instead of it following that prior path, it created a new path slightly higher, which is fine on this side of the cut. But as you can see, my prior cut, when it started, cut that deep. And then when I did my final cut, it did over here. So this is the first set. It's preliminary. I'm all right with a few different little mishaps and issues. And when you're done, this bit's doing me a lot better. Just swapping the bit has created a lot better cuts. The downfall of anything that you're cutting on an angle from wood grain, you're cutting against the grain, it's going to cause little jumps and bounces that you have to then sand off, and a little bit of overcut. So that's something that can be cured very easily by just adjusting your settings to where your bit runs slower. It increases your cut time, but it'll give you a better end result. In this instance, I'm going to be sanding it so I can take those out just fine, and I can drop just that little bit of a shoulder ever so slightly, and it won't be necessarily noticeable in the finished result. But this is all learning. So I wanted to give myself a larger project that I could then learn each of these little mistakes and understanding. The other issue that you may have seen in one of the prior time lapses is I wasn't monitoring my cut depth. So I was trying to cut this to where I'd almost leave a very thin tab all the way around, or it would just barely cut through the material. So it cut through the material and it was running what it thought was its final pass in depth, and it was cutting into my spoil board a bit, which is fine. Downfall is that it had cut and dropped this loose, so now on its approach going through the full rest of the pattern, it had cut around this, and this piece is free floating. Got up to here, and right here in the free floating instance, it just barely caught one of the fibers, yanked this up and wedged it, and stopped my motor. Now, if I wasn't there and able to immediately tend to the machine would have just keep going because it doesn't know anything different, and it would have continued to wedge, and it would have either flexed and snapped my bit, it could have damaged my gantry, it could have bent my screw, and out of all that, I would have rather just snapped the bit. At worst, it might cost you, depending what bit you have, anywhere from as cheap as a couple bucks to $50 for a bit, versus if I damage this whole gantry and everything, I don't even know if it'd be worth fixing. Once I get all the components together and purchase each individual part, it could get pretty darn close to just the whole unit again, depending on how much got damaged just by this trying to finish itself out and do the pattern. Your limiter switches will help from this destroying itself by going outside of its X, Y, and Z axis. But besides that, the safeguard is you. You're pretty much the safeguard for this machine. So keep that in mind while you're playing around with it. But I'm enjoying this. And so far, after those two pieces cut out, that means that I have two more side pieces I'm going to cut. And then I have about 11 plus, maybe I think it's actually 14 individual hexagons to cut out. And then at that point, the board will be done, but it'll be on to the laser engraving side. Alright, so I think I'm going to conclude this as part 2 for right now. I've got all 6 perimeter pieces printed, or not printed rather, but CNC'd out. Everything has pretty good tolerances. I sanded a little bit extra just to kind of give a little bit of motion and movement, just like the original cardboard version, such as this piece here. Otherwise, each of the pieces are pretty darn spot on. There is ever so slightly a little bit of overhang from the original cardboard, but I was planning on that, so each one of my pieces are just ever so slightly smaller than the original game pieces because I dimensioned them in the CNC and with the software for these pieces to be exact, just as my friend did very well with these guys as well. So any amount of sanding is going to reduce the size of the piece. So just kind of keep that in mind. You can either slightly oversize if you want to be absolutely perfect. I personally feel with a board game, it's nice to have that ability to where if you're setting up the map and going off of a generator, or if you're flipping the pieces, they're not so tight on tolerance that if I need to grab one of these corner pieces to pull it out, and every piece is in the game already, like in the board, I'm not going to have that lack of ability to just pull straight up or kind of have a little bit of wiggle. So personally, I enjoy having a little extra movement in the board. And this is the first kind of mock-up, or this is Mark 1 essentially for me, just kind of doing this myself. as I've said before, I have no CNC experience whatsoever. What you guys are seeing is what I have so far gone into this journey, and I am gathering knowledge as best I can, but I do not have any degrees. I do not have any education in CNC whatsoever. Anything I have learned has only been through YouTube. So if you guys are liking this build so far, if you want to see it complete, make sure and subscribe to the channel and follow me so that way you know exactly when the next video will be coming out. I should be hopefully done with this by next week. Right now as it sits, I only have 6 of the 19 tiles, as well as I only have 6 of the perimeter pieces done and ready. So I have a little bit left to do, an additional 13 pieces to be made, and I'm also going to be laser engraving all of the pieces as well in the next video. So thank you all so very much. Don't forget to hit like if you enjoyed the video series so far, and we shall see you in the next one. Thanks again.